A few weeks ago, I started buying silver, bars, physical, ounces at a time. Now, I bought it for the dumbest reason that someone in my line of work can, and that's because a few people told me to, and I didn't really check into it at all. I work in institutional sales for a trading online broker. I look at trades and order flow all day, and I'm exactly the sort of person that should know better than to buy based on a story, but I didn't. Now, I went and did the homework after that I should have done first. And what I did find is a really fascinating story that goes back thousands of years, from ancient Athens through to the building of empires, through to pirate history, through to billionaires going bankrupt, and then today, a supply problem that's real. So let's get into it. The thing about silver that no one really tells you is that throughout history, it's had two separate lives. The first is obvious, it's been money. So in ancient Athens, it's been used as coins. In Rome, it's been used in coins. Then all through human history, effectively, until very recently, it's been used as currency. And then recently, it's become something completely different, which is an industrial input, a raw material. So in your solar panels, in the phone in your hand, the AI chips running the world now, all of these things require physical silver. The reason for that is silver has the highest electrical conductivity of any metal in the world, right? So gold sits in a vault, looks pretty, does a great job of that, mind you, but silver has a whole different job to do. That money versus material distinction is a thread that runs through this entire story, especially as we get to the modern history of silver and what it's currently used for. So this video is going to have 4 separate chapters. First is around the ancient empires and the use of silver. Then we're going to go into pirate gold. Then we're talking about billionaires who went bankrupt trying to corner the silver market. And then what silver is actually used for today. So bear with me. Let's start with a war that silver basically won. So picture this, right? It's ancient Athens. About 40 kilometers outside of the city, there's a hillside called Lorion, and under it, there's lots of silver. The Athenians have been pulling lots of different metals out of this mine for years, and then in 483 BC, they hit a monster vein of silver, a genuine windfall. The city had a big debate that any modern government or any corporate would have. What do you do with all that money? And they came up with a few different ideas. Did they want to split the cash and pay the citizens a dividend, reinvest it into business, you name it? Everyone had a different say. But there was one politician named Themistocles who stood up and argued to take all of the silver and build a navy of 200 warships. Okay, it was an unpopular pitch. Imagine your politicians these days, like the Saudis, if they took all of their oil money and just built an army out of it. Big, unpopular decision. People want the money. But he managed to convince the people. And so a year later, the Persian Empire actually invaded into Greece to wipe ancient Greece off of the map. The Persians were the biggest world empire at that time, or one of the superpowers of the time, and they had the bigger army. But Themistocles lured their fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis, and that's where their numbers meant nothing, because the Athenian Navy that was bought with that silver destroyed them and absolutely scorched earth their forces. No silver, no navy, no Athens. And for the historians among us, you're now thinking, right? No Athens, no Greek Golden Age, no democracy, no philosophy, the cornerstone of what our Western world is built upon. Who knows if that would have shaped the world as we know it now? So our way of life is a result of the butterfly effect that started when the Athenians struck on that monster silver vein. Pretty interesting. But not to romanticize it, that silver came out of the ground on the backs of 20,000 enslaved people, hacking at a rock in tunnels that were barely a meter high. So horrible conditions. And this is sort of a recurring theme with silver and mining that's gone throughout human history to effectively today. The people that are mining the silver and striking the metal are very rarely the people getting rich off it. Right? So anyway, Further down the line, the Romans took the silver coin and paid their legions. So the word salary comes from Roman pay. And then Rome started running low on silver. They did what most desperate governments do and cause inflation, right? They cheat. They quietly mix different metals into the coins rather than just keeping it 100% or 90% silver. So the face on the coin appears the same, but the value of the coin decreases. And that's early stage debasement of the currency. Pretty interesting. Rather than keyboards and money printing, it's using a hammer and using metal mixing at the core elements to debase the currency. So same playbook 2,000 years before the Federal Reserve. Remember that. So let's skip forward now to 1545 in Bolivia, 4,000 meters up in the Andes, where there's a mountain called Potosi. The story goes that a local herder named Diego got caught out overnight in the cold. So he lit a fire to keep warm, and that fire caused a trickle of silver to actually melt out of the rock beneath him. Whether it's a true story or just a good yarn, what's underneath that mountain was the single richest silver deposit in all of human history. The Spanish, who'd just conquered the region, went nuts over this. So within a few decades, Potosi actually became one of the largest cities on earth and was even bigger than London at the time. It was a boom town that was 4 kilometers up in a freezing mountain where the rich were importing silk, porcelain, Venetian glass, diamonds, and women were walking cobblestone streets with shoes that had silver heels. Right underneath all of the wealth was the other side of the trade. Again, they had a forced labor system called the mita. Indigenous workers and enslaved Africans were sent into the shafts for shifts that would literally last for days at a time. The mountain has a nickname that tells you everything about how this place operated. Potosi, the mountain that eats men. Estimates of the dead over the centuries run into millions of people, and the silver economy that I'm describing is literally built on an industrial scale, slave labor and body count. It's really horrible. But here's where it gets quite interesting from both a market's point of view and a pirate history point of view, which is something I love. They minted that silver into a coin, the real de ocho, a piece of 8. If you know your history, you know this becomes the first currency that's global. So before any central bank, any treaty, any Federal Reserve, or before the SWIFT payment system, this single coin was accepted nearly everywhere, from Spain to China. It was legal tender in the United States until 1857 even. During this period, between then and now, China also changed their tax system into silver. So the Brits were sending loads and loads of silver into China. But I digress. The little 8 that was stamped on the pieces of 8, the peso symbol, is effectively where the dollar sign in today's money now comes from. So every time you type a dollar sign, you're typing a 400-year-old Spanish silver symbol. It's fascinating, really. So money and silver have been associated together for the longest time. Now, Spain physically had to ship this silver across the Atlantic from the Andes to Spain. And nothing in history attracts predators like a slow ship that's full of money. So Francis Drake, who was knighted by the Queen of England, hero of the realm, depending on what end of the cannon you're standing on, right? But he was one of the most successful pirates that ever lived. And he called the Spanish silver route the treasure house of the world. He raided it relentlessly and had state-sponsored robbery with the royal mark, obviously. The British Crown took their cut, and that's not a side story of the age of piracy. This is the main story of the age of piracy. Stealing that Spanish gold and Spanish silver, which is often overlooked, by the way. The silver part of this is often overlooked. But Spanish gold takes the main highlight because gold's obviously worth a lot more. But the silver was super valuable as well. And take away the treasure fleets and, the rum drinking. Pirates are just guys with boats. The treasure's what makes it exciting. So that's fantastic. The Spanish ran a second route across the Pacific as well, which was called the Manila Galleons, and that went straight to China. Somewhere between a third and half of all the silver ever dug out of the New World actually ended up in China. And that's, like I mentioned before, because China had put its entire tax system on the silver standard. So it was almost a bottomless buyer. The world's first global trade route was, at its core, just a silver dump or a silver movement channel. Dig it out of the mountain in Bolivia, send it to Spain, and send it to China. Pretty interesting stuff. So in China, it was exchanged for silk, porcelain, etc. Now, you also want to park that because China still shows up as the world's biggest silver buyer for a completely different reason. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, right? So now let's move on from that story into the billionaire story I promised you. There were two brothers that tried to corner the silver market. Meet Nelson Bunker Hunt and his brother Herbert, sons of a Texas oil billionaire, and they were absolutely convinced that paper money was going to get inflated into worthlessness. Sound familiar? Well, that's the same fear that's driving a lot of what happens in the markets these days. Anyway, the Hunts decided that the answer was silver. Not a sensible allocation either. They threw diversification out of the window, and they tried to buy as much of the world's silver as humanly possible. Physical bars, huge leveraged positions in the futures market as well. They were trying to corner the market. They wanted to control the price of silver. And for a while, it actually started working quite well. Through 1979 and into early 1980, silver went from about $6 an ounce to nearly $50 an ounce US. That's an 8 times factor. On the way up, ordinary life started breaking, so doctors couldn't afford X-ray film, Tiffany's jacked up their prices and slagged off the Hunts for it. People were melting down their grandmother's jewelry and cutlery to sell. It started getting a bit crazy, and then the exchange changed the rules. So COMEX, which is one of the exchanges, brought in Silver Rule 7, which basically choked off the ability to keep buying leverage positions. The price stopped going up because there wasn't that constant buy-side demand now. And when you're that leveraged, you don't need price to crash for you to die. It just needs to stop going up. And then the financing cost on your positions become quite large very quickly. So bring in March 27th, 1980. It was called Silver Thursday, where the price collapsed, almost 50% in a single day, from roughly $21 to under $11. Margin calls were coming in, and the Hunt brothers couldn't meet the margin calls. $7 billion of paper wealth turned into $1.7 billion of debt. They were so far underwater that they threatened to take their banks and brokers down with them. There's an old line from the oil man, Paul Getty, or J. Paul Getty. If you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. The Hunts were the bank's problem, and a consortium had to bail them out to stop the whole financial system from catching fire. They were later convicted of manipulation, fined and banned from commodity trading entirely. I tell that story for a reason, and it's not just because it's a good yarn. It is a good yarn, but it's also a really important lesson for anyone in financial markets. You can have the right trade, the right rules for the trade, you can have the right idea about what the market's going to do, and still absolutely lose a lot of money. Because they were right that silver was scarce, and they were right that money's being debased. I mean, look at what the US dollar buys 100 years ago versus what it buys now. That's debasement. But they were too over leveraged, and they were impatient, and the rules changed underneath them. Earlier this year in gold and silver, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange also changed the margin requirements on gold and silver and increased them, causing forced liquidations of positions. These sorts of rules changes drastically impact the market. And when you're highly leveraged in the market, you're so prone to risk. Anyway, let's get into what silver is used for today. How did silver stop being money? For most of the 20th century, silver's biggest use wasn't actually in coins or in jewelry. It was in photography. So silver is freakishly sensitive to light, and that's the chemistry that makes photography work. At its peak, Kodak alone was burning through more than 50 million ounces of silver a year. 50 million ounces, okay? Every family photo, every x-ray, every movie reel, they all relied on silver. Now, the smartphone came into the picture, digital cameras arrived, and it basically deleted that entire industrial demand for silver. So if silver was only for money and photographs, this is where the story would end, right? But silver has the highest electrical and thermal conductivity of any metal on Earth, like I said before. Nothing beats it. So as the photo business died, electronics and electric hardware came into the market. A new appetite took over, and it's that industrial drive. Now, solar is the big one. Photovoltaic cells, if I've said that right, use silver paste to carry the current, and solar is the largest buyer of silver in the world. To put a number on it, in 2024, solar alone ate around 197 million ounces of silver. So that's roughly 4 times what Kodak was going through, right? And it's 1/5 of all the silver used on the planet, just in one application that barely existed at scale 20 years ago and is only starting to scale up more and more now. Every electric vehicle has meaningful silver in it as well. Every 5G base station, the data centers and the chips that are running these data centers that AI can't function without, all of these have silver. And the brutal thing for anyone betting against it, silver isn't optional, you know? A solar manufacturer can't just decide not to use silver. There's no cheap drop-in replacement with the same level of conductivity. The demand is, to use the word that analysts love, it's structural. So the oldest use of it all is making a comeback as well. Silver kills bacteria, and the ancient Greeks and Romans that we talked about a bit earlier, they would drop silver coins into water and into wine to keep it from going off, and stored food in silver vessels as well. Today, that exact same property shows up in hospital wound dressings, antimicrobial coatings, water purification systems as well. So 3,000 years apart, the same metals being used for the same things and also some other things. And I think it's absolutely fascinating how silver is being used in so many industrial capacities, as well as having that multifaceted use of money. So silver is now being consumed 59% because of industrial demand, right? And around 20 years ago, that demand was consuming about 40% of the silver use. Silver's quietly switched careers. It used to be money, and now it used to be money that happened to be useful. Now it's useful and happens to be money. It sort of brings me back to where I started. I'd heard a story that silver was a good buy and that the fundamentals for silver are very bullish. Now, why is that? There's a buy-side demand that is not being met with the supply for several years now. The Silver Institute, which is the industry's body, so bear that in mind with this, but they report that silver has run at a structural deficit for every year since 2021, and demand has outstripped new supply for 5 years running. Okay. In 2024, the gap was about 149 million ounces, and stacked 2021 through to 2024 together, the combined shortfall is equivalent to roughly 10 months of global mine production. So that's a genuine, persistent imbalance, and the green energy and tech demands for silver is exactly what's causing this attention to it in the physical bullion dealer space. So my take is the fundamental story is true. The deficit is real, the industrial demand is real, and unlike gold, this stuff is getting consumed now. It's being used in industrial purposes. It's not just there to sit in a vault, be used a little bit in industrial purposes like gold can be in mobile phones, etc. There's a real tailwind behind the silver demand. So I'm not going to be selling my silver, that's for sure. Thank you for anyone that's made it this far in the video. I really hope you've enjoyed this, and I really hope that this year is the year that your life really starts to flourish. You see the opportunities to make the impact that you know you're going to make in this world. You know, it's very dystopian at the moment, hearing so much about AI replacing jobs and the United States' geopolitical issues. The future of the world as we know it seems to be more and more questionable every day as social media divides people. And I want to let you guys know that every single day is a new opportunity to build a better world. You know, you can have an impact and you can have a lasting longevity, a lasting legacy. So I hope you will be happy to make a better world. Thanks for watching.